One of the advantages of the kind of approach that Foucault takes to telling the history of the state, and he uses this expression, the history of governmentality, because it is very much a history of these arts and techniques, is to sort of draw attention to different techniques that have not always been, I think, foregrounded or recognized as especially relevant for understanding what states are and what they do today. And so a good example of that is Foucault's long kind of investigation of pastoralism that he occupies a number of the lectures in security, territory, population. It's in pastoralism, it's in the history of techniques of kind of forming people as a flock and as individual sheep that need to be cared for and conducted, that he finds in some ways the origins of government more generally, if by government we understand that to be conduct in conduct. It's in these pastoral practices that the state will sort of find a way at some point to engage in a care for its people. But he talks about other practices and techniques as well. So for example, he talks about raison d'etat, the sort of moment from maybe the 1600s onwards, where the state comes to be understood as a sort of unit, as a node or as a entity caught up in a field of forces. And then he talks about liberalism, and he has a distinctive understanding of liberalism, not really as a philosophy or as an ideology, not as a value system, but again as an art of governing, and he calls it an economic art of governing, because compared with some of the other arts of governing he's looked at, and another of these was police, whereas police is kind of very much about trying to regulate the life of a community in all its sort of infinitesimal details. Liberalism kind of says, well, we know from these new knowledges of say, political economy that there are markets and that they have their own kind of immanent forces and dynamics, and that they're capable of their own sorts of forms of equilibria, so that rather than trying to control everything from the center, we can kind of work with the grain of immanent forces, forces of population growth and expansion and decline, for market forces. So liberal government has to work with all of these forces rather than sort of try to govern everything in a sort of top-down way through regulations in the way that a police mentality might. And Foucault uses the word police here in its archaic form, not in its modern form where it refers to the cops, okay? So rather than trying to govern everything and regulate everything, liberalism has to be economic government, it has to be efficient government, it has to work with the grain. So it needs law, it needs regulation, but law and regulation are always tested, always sort of held to account, always held up against these immanent forces that now are recognized as existing beyond the state. So, you know, political economists become very important authorities and experts at this time, because they are the ones who have this kind of privileged knowledge of how economic forces and markets operate, and politics has to, in some ways, answer now to markets and to the knowledge of markets, but answer to other imminent processes as well, you know, the processes of demographics, for example.